the fall of 1942, the United States Army Air Corps was losing bombers and crews over Europe faster than it could replace them. And into this meat grinder stepped Arthur Frechette, an 18-year-old college dropout from Groton, Connecticut. He volunteered for flight school. But on a gusty training day in Arkansas, he ignored his instructor's standing orders and attempted an unauthorized crosswind landing at a seldom-used airfield. The trainer, a flimsy biplane the cadets called the Yellow Peril, caught a sudden gust, flipped onto its nose, and stood there crumpled at a 90-degree angle to the runway. Frechette climbed out, saw a jeep racing toward him, and knew his piloting days were finished. He was washed out of flight school and sent to navigation training in Monroe, Louisiana, the very job he had wanted from the start. By early 1944, the need for replacement air crews had grown even more desperate. George Ahern, a 5'5" teenager from Brantford, Connecticut, was among the new wave of volunteers, and his small frame made him an ideal candidate for the most exposed position on a B-17 Flying Fortress, ball turret gunner. He would be curled inside a powered plexiglass sphere slung beneath the bomber's belly, operating twin 50 caliber machine guns while flak burst around him and German fighters closed in. Ahern completed his gunnery training and was assigned to the crew of Lieutenant Marvin Walker, a stern pilot who ran his aircraft with an iron hand and demanded absolute discipline from every man. Not every obstacle came from the enemy. Bob Valliere, a sharp navigator from Brooklyn who had aced his navigation school entrance exam with a perfect score, was stopped by something far more ordinary, a hernia that had been there since birth. Doctors operated and grounded him for 2 months, and by the time he recovered, his entire bomber crew had shipped out to England without him. For 7 months, Valliere sat stranded at MacDill Field in Florida, his records lost in the Army's vast bureaucracy, watching one replacement crew after another head to war. The question that hung over all 3 young men was whether their training and luck would be enough to survive what waited over Germany. The summer of 1944 found George Ahern crossing the Atlantic with a crew of Lieutenant Marvin Walker. They landed at Polebrook, an air base north of London, and were assigned a patched-up, battle-weary B-17. On July 6th, George climbed into his ball turret for his first combat mission. The target was German V-1 rocket launch sites in France. The flak was light and no enemy fighters appeared, but the young gunner from Connecticut knew he had crossed a line. A few missions later, the Luftwaffe found them. German Mi-109 fighters appeared at 9 o'clock, cruising just out of gun range. George swiveled his turret and tracked them through his sights. One fighter peeled off and attacked from below, a rookie mistake that gave the ball turret gunner extra seconds to aim. George pressed both triggers and watched his rounds tear into the Messerschmitt's belly. The fighter erupted in flames and fell away. On July 13th, the target was Munich. The sky over the city was black with flak smoke, the residue of earlier bomb groups. Fresh explosions rocked the B-17 as the 351st began its bomb run. George heard shrapnel striking the ball turret, thumping against the plexiglass like hail. The bomber returned to Polebrook with more than 100 flak holes. Not one man on board had been hit. In September, Walker's crew was granted a 48-hour pass to London. 6 of them crammed into a taxi, and the driver promised a tour they would never forget. He swerved through busy streets, pointing out historic sites and his favorite pubs. The route took them past Big Ben, and an elderly photographer with a tripod offered to take their picture. They agreed, figuring it would make a good souvenir. The old man adjusted his camera, and the 6 airmen lined up shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, the clock tower loomed against a cloudy September sky. The shutter clicked, but the development took longer than the photographer had promised. The airmen were in no hurry. They passed a few minutes in idle talk while the taxi driver leaned against his cab, waiting. 200 miles away, a German V-2 rocket was climbing into space. It reached 60 miles above the Earth and then fell toward London at 3,600 miles per hour. There was no siren, no warning, no sound of engines. The explosion shook the city blocks from where the airmen stood. Dark smoke rose above the skyline. The taxi driver went pale. That was the street he always took. The photograph had delayed them. They were alive because of a picture. That same autumn, Arthur Frechette completed his navigation training and joined a replacement crew headed for the 15th Air Force in Italy. He reached Foggia in October, stepping off the truck into a sea of mud. The base was a collection of Quonset huts and army tents. His new home had a brick floor and a homemade burner fed by a gasoline tank outside. It was a fire trap, he knew, but it was home. On November 22nd, Frechette flew his first combat mission. The target was the marshalling yard at Regensburg, Germany. The weather turned bad as the formation crossed into enemy territory. Snowflakes blew in through the side openings and built up on the gunners and their weapons. The bombers could barely see each other. Mid-air collisions became a bigger worry than the German defenses. The anti-aircraft batteries gave them a hot welcome. Black pocks of smoke punctured the white sky as the B-17s blindly released their bombs. One burst exploded just ahead of the nose, sending shrapnel through the plexiglass. A piece almost spent bounced off Frechette's flak vest. That was the moment the war became personal. Those people were trying to knock him down. By mid-December, George Ahern had completed his combat tour and was home in Connecticut, enjoying leave before his next assignment. For Arthur Frechette, the war was far from over. On the morning of December 29th, he was assigned to fly as navigator with a new crew commanded by Lieutenant Lyle Pearson. Pearson was a seasoned pilot from Minnesota, a calm and confident commander who had already earned a Distinguished Flying Cross. His regular co-pilot, Harry Livers, waved goodbye from a jeep, calling out, "See you when you get back, Lyle." Pearson smiled and replied, "Harry, I've got it made." The target that day was the rail yards at Castelfranco in northern Italy. The weather was clear, the Alps visible in the distance. As the formation began its bomb run, the tail gunner shouted a warning. Flak at 9 o'clock. An explosion rocked the bomber instantly. A German anti-aircraft shell had torn into the bomb bay, severing the control cables. Fire erupted, and the aircraft went into a flat spin. Pearson hit the bailout alarm. Frechette scrambled toward the escape door, but the centrifugal force pinned him in place. Then the B-17 exploded. The blast hurled Frechette unconscious into the cold December sky. His parachute still unopened. He fell at 150 miles per hour, tumbling like a rag doll through 15,000 feet. The biting cold air stung his face and revived him just as the mountain rushed up. He slammed into a snowy slope, bounced and tumbled down the mountainside. When he finally stopped, he could not see, hear, or feel anything. He lay motionless, his right hand still clenched around the ripcord ring. The parachute was still packed. He was alive, but barely. Lyle Pearson also survived the blast. He regained consciousness in midair, pulled his ripcord, and landed safely. Charles Lyon, the waist gunner, was captured by an Austrian family who fed him soup and gave him a warm bed before German soldiers took him away. Frechette was found by a German soldier who had watched him fall. Carried to a hut, he was reunited with Pearson, the co-pilot Sam Wheeler, the bombardier William Ferguson, and the tail gunner Grant Dory. 4 of their crewmates were dead. Soon they were transported down the mountain to a German anti-aircraft battery. That evening, the wounded airmen were loaded onto a horse-drawn cart and taken to the town of Brixen. From there, Frechette was moved by ambulance to a hotel converted into a hospital in Murano, deep in the Alps. It was the evening of New Year's Eve when he arrived in the operating room. 3 hours later, he woke in a body cast. German officers and women in evening gowns burst into his room. Laughing and shouting Happy New Year, he had completely forgotten the date. A pretty nurse later brought him the only English book in the hospital, a worn collection of poetry from 1870. Frechette's injuries were severe: a fractured left kneecap, torn ligaments, a severely sprained right ankle, a fractured right elbow, a concussion, and frostbite on his fingers, toes, and face. 2 German soldiers named Hans and Hanslow shared his room. Despite being enemies, they helped him eat, shave, and even bathe. Frechette gave them his daily ration of cigarettes. For weeks, the hospital staff treated him kindly, but that goodwill evaporated in mid-February when news of the Dresden bombing reached them. The nurses wept, and the roommates turned silent and angry. Frechette was suddenly an enemy again. While Frechette recovered in that German hospital, Bob Valliere finally received his assignment. In early January, the stranded navigator was ordered to Great Ashfield, England, and joined the crew of Lieutenant Michael Swana, a 20-year-old pilot from Massachusetts. Swanna's crew was given a B-17 named the Stork Club. On their first combat mission, a faulty radio compass led them far off course. When they broke through the clouds, there was not another bomber in sight. Swanna pushed the throttles forward and asked Valliere to plot an intercept course. Valliere calculated a heading and they raced to catch their group. They spotted a formation ahead. As they approached, Valliere identified the tail markings, the 100th bomb group, the infamous Bloody 100th. The crew voted unanimously not to join them. They flew on and soon found their own 385th bomb group. The relief was short-lived. The tail gunner reported a B-17 behind them firing at them. It was a German-captured fortress, camouflaged as an American. Swanna ordered his gunners to return fire, and the enemy aircraft eventually broke off and disappeared. The crew returned to Great Ashfield, shaken but safe. By the end of January, Frechette had recovered enough to hobble on crutches through the hospital halls in Murano. He was still a prisoner, but the two Hanses remained his friends. Valliere had flown 2 more missions, his navigational skills sharpening with each flight, and in Connecticut, George Ahern enjoyed the quiet of home, knowing his combat tour was behind him. The war was not over, but for these 3 bomber boys, the worst was yet to come. By February of 1945, the war was grinding toward its final months, but for Arthur Frechette, the worst was not yet over. The friendly atmosphere at the Murano hospital had curdled news of the Dresden firebombing, which killed tens of thousands of German civilians, turned his former friends cold. Nurses who had once smiled at him now wept openly in the hallways. One of them had family in Dresden, and her grief was raw and bitter. Frechette was soon judged well enough to travel. He was ordered to dress in his torn flight clothes and escorted to a waiting van. The van took him to the train yard in Murano, where he was packed into a crowded boxcar with other Allied prisoners. The journey east took them through the Alpine valleys under cover of darkness, until they reached Stalag 18 in Spittal, Austria, a barbed wire compound guarded by machine gun towers. Inside the camp, Frechette was assigned to a small room with 3 British officers and 2 Americans. Food was scarce. A bowl of soup, a piece of black bread, and a dab of jelly were the daily ration. But the prisoners had a secret, a hidden radio built by a resourceful South African sergeant named Wally Tempest. Every night, one of the prisoner doctors would retrieve the radio from beneath a floorboard in the commandant's own office, and they would listen to the BBC broadcasts tracking the Allied advance a few hundred miles northwest. Bob Valliere was preparing for a mission unlike any he had flown before. The war in Europe was nearly over, but the people of the Netherlands were starving. Under a negotiated truce, American B-17s would fly at low altitude and drop food. On May 2nd, Valliere climbed into the nose compartment of the Stork Club for the Mercy Run. The bomb bay was filled, not with explosives, but with boxes of meat, cheese, flour, and coffee. The Stork Club crossed the Dutch coast at just 400 feet. Below, crowds of emaciated civilians waved from the streets. A rooftop had been painted with the words, "Thanks, Yanks." As Valliere released the food over the designated drop zone near Hilversum, the bomber began its turn back toward England. Then, without warning, a German anti-aircraft gunner opened fire. 2 red flashes erupted from the ground, and the left wing of the fortress was torn open by a ragged 2-foot hole. Lieutenant Michael Swanna felt the controls go dead in his hands. The bomber yanked hard to the left, trying to spiral into a spin. Swanna knew he had to keep the left wing elevated to counteract the drag, so he held the aircraft at a 30-degree bank to the right. For 2 agonizing hours, he and his co-pilot fought the controls, nursing the damaged fortress across the North Sea. They landed safely at Great Ashfield, the last 8th Air Force bomber to be hit by enemy fire in the war. The crew would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. By early May, the guards at Stalag 18 had begun to disappear. One morning, a normally stone-faced German soldier told Frechette, "The war is over, we will all be going home soon." The radio had confirmed that the British Army was very close. Soon, an American Air Force doctor parachuted from a B-24 and landed outside the camp. There were no German guards left to challenge him. He brought the news that food was on the way and evacuation was imminent. A few days before the Germans surrendered, the British Army arrived. Frechette was loaded into an ambulance and driven to an airfield near the Yugoslav border. Within hours, he was resting in an Allied hospital in Italy. The doctors examined his fractured knee, his damaged elbow, his frostbitten fingers. They told him he would heal, but he would need surgery on his arm once he reached the United States. Before he left for home, Frechette was escorted to the hospital lobby with dozens of other wounded soldiers. The entire hospital staff stood and applauded. Army officers moved down the line, stopping to salute each man. When the presiding officer stepped in front of him, he pinned a Purple Heart to the navigator's shirt. Arthur Frechette had fallen 15,000 feet without a parachute. He had been a prisoner of the enemy, and he was going home. Frechette returned to the United States that spring. He was admitted to a hospital in Massachusetts, not far from his parents in Groton, Connecticut, who had only recently learned their son was alive. He underwent 2 operations on his right arm and months of physical therapy. By March 1946, he was released from military service. He re-enrolled at the University of Connecticut, and in the summer of 1947, he met a teacher named Doris Barnard on the Vermont campus. They were married in 1948. Frechette graduated the following year and spent 4 decades in education, retiring as a curriculum supervisor in 1986. George Ahern returned home to Connecticut that fall. He had kept up his correspondence with Marie Spillane, the young woman his sister had introduced him to through letters. They arranged to meet on the New Haven Green. Marie wore a red rose so he could spot her. When they saw each other, the nervousness melted away. They were married on October 19, 1946, and raised 4 children in Branford. Ahern worked for 25 years as a sales representative, then returned to school and became superintendent of the town's waste treatment plant, retiring in 1990. Bob Valliere came home and finished his mechanical engineering degree at Michigan State University. He married Nancy Dalzell in June 1950 and took her to her first Major League Baseball game, where he introduced her to his cousin, manager Leo Durocher. Valliere spent 45 years building his grandfather's importing business in New York City, eventually moving the headquarters to New Haven, Connecticut. Decades after the war, he visited his old bombardier, Marvin Heidecker, in Florida. Displayed prominently in Heidecker's home was the string of rosary beads that Valliere's mother had sent to him during the war. In the summer of 1998, Lyle Pearson and Charles Lyon traveled together to the town of Brixen, Italy. Local citizens had erected 2 stone monuments on nearby mountains to honor the dead airmen of 2 separate bomber crashes. Pearson and Lyon came to pay tribute to the 4 members of their crew who had died on December 29, 1944. Michael Swana, the pilot of the Stork Club, returned to Massachusetts, earned a degree in physics from Clark University, and worked for more than 30 years as an engineer. William Ferguson, the bombardier who survived the crash of Pearson's B-17, returned to Missouri and ran his family's Chevrolet dealership until his retirement. After the dedication, a man who had been 11 years old when the fuselage of their B-17 fell near his family's farmhouse led them to his basement. His father had saved a few pieces of the wreckage. Today, one of the propeller hubs of that fortress sits on a shelf in Pearson's den, a quiet monument to the boys who never made it home. Charles Lyon died in May 2005. Arthur Frechette passed away in 2003, 59 years after he cheated death on an Austrian mountain. Bob Valliere died in January 2006, but the stories of what they did and what they survived did not die with them. They were passed down to children and grandchildren, shared at school assemblies, and preserved in the reunions of the bomb groups they had once served. The men of the 301st, the 351st, and the 385th never forgot their own. A photograph exists of 6 young gunners from the crew of the B-17 Torchy Tess, standing shoulder to shoulder in London with Big Ben rising behind them. They had stopped on a whim to have that picture taken. That decision saved their lives when a German rocket destroyed the street they would have been traveling. The photograph is a simple thing, just silver and paper, but it holds the weight of a moment when chance reached down and chose them. That is the story of every bomber boy who came home. They flew through a sky full of flak and fighters, and by luck or by grace they kept going. The ones who did not make it are remembered by the monuments that stand in quiet places, and by the men who returned to visit them decades later, still carrying the names of their fallen friends. If you have your own family stories from this era, stories of fathers or uncles or neighbors who served in the war, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one, and if you would like to help us continue telling these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Thank you for listening and for remembering them with us.